Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this Frame Quilting Friday video. I have a new quilt to quilt. This is another charity quilt that I picked up from my local quilt guild and I want to stitch it up pretty quick. So I've been working on the same quilt basically for 3 weeks and I like to mix it up, and after I finish a quilt that takes a little bit more time, I do something that finishes up really fast. So my goal is to basically be able to put this quilt on my long arm and take it off within about 2 hours. So this quilt is unique because it's not really a quilt, it's a panel. It is basically a border fabric, and the Quilt Guild, rather than try and be really fussy about cutting borders, they just decided, hey, we'll just take this yardage and cut it into panels and people can then just quilt them. And it's great practice for long arm quilting. It's great practice for using your channel locks to get those nice straight lines. If I wanted to, I could go in and try and trace these veins and leaves that I've got going on here. I think that's a little fiddly and probably not something I want to do for this particular project. If I had red thread already loaded in the long arm, I might be tempted to try that, but I'm using white thread only. So I'm basically going to just focus on those lines of white that I can stitch straight across the quilt. I'm going to use the channel locks that come on the Grace Continuum frame. And this is something that comes standard. You might have seen it before. I use them a lot. They're the little lock here. Has a little red knob, and this one controls how the machine moves side to side. There's a lock even further back that's on the carriage that controls the machine moving forward and back. So if I wanted to do straight lines going this way, then I would go all the way around and hit the channel lock on that side. But what's nice is I can actually reach this one that controls the vertical line, so that's really good. And I'm just going to use that function and stitch these straight lines. Now, if you have a continuum frame and you didn't have channel locks, please send an email to Grace Company. They should come standard with your machine, but they do come in a fairly small box, so they're easy to misplace whenever you're putting your frame together. So it might have just been one of those things that kind of got lost in the shuffle whenever you were putting your frame and your machine together. I know at that stage in the putting the frame together part of this whole thing, I was a little like, do I really want this thing on there? You know, do I not? And I was tempted to just skip it because it just seemed like an extra silly step. But I was really glad Dad encouraged me to go on ahead and get them attached, and I use them quite a lot. So I think it's a really nice little detail about this frame. Okay, so I'm going to just stitch down, and I'm going to put my needle basically right in the middle of that white line. And I have very carefully loaded this quilt in the frame, but even still, I might have a little bit of wiggle wobble. You know, it is a quilt, it is fabric, it does move. So I've put my needle down, I've locked my channel lock, so I am locked in that position so that when I hit the button, even when I try and wiggle the machine back and forth, it's not going anywhere. It is locked in that position. And all I have to do is just keep a nice, slow, steady pace all the way down the frame. And honestly, this is the hard part. The hard part is not going too fast. Because, you know, it does feel a little boring. And if you hear your machine beep, then you know you're going too fast. You need to slow down a little bit. But it is very speedy. And all you have to do is just simply lightly nudge the machine down the length of the quilt. I am watching out for, you know, the quilt doing anything weird and being wobbly bobbly, but as you can see, I really spread it out flat here, so it's solid. Okay, now I'm going to lift up on those channel locks so that way my machine can move again. I'm going to stitch down, and I think I'm going to knock out, I need to stitch at least a little bit within this area, and I know that won't look all that great on top of this detailed pattern. But if I do the same thing over all of them, then I think it's going to look okay. So what I might do, let's see here, I'm going to grab a ruler. So I'm just going to measure right across that decorative area, and it looks like it's a 4-inch space. And I'm just going to mark a little line right in the middle, so 2 inches. And the reason being, you know my batting is rated for stitches up to 8 inches apart, but down the full length, that's quite a lot of space to leave open, 4 inches wide, and then the full length of the quilt. So I'm going to do a few lines maybe here, I might keep it roughly about an inch apart or so. And I think that that will be plenty of quilting. It can be washed, it can be enjoyed, and it's not too much quilting to do, but it's also not too little. So my first line is going to be right here, and I'm going to do a little bit of overlap of those leaves. Again, I don't think that's a big deal. Nothing to worry about. Lock my channel locks and stitch on down. And this is the thing, this is kind of an experiment. You know, just like whenever I stitched over the that farm panel, when I stitched right on top of it, I was a little worried, you know, what was that going to look like? And it's easy to get locked up and be afraid and be too afraid to try something and just see what it's going to look like. And you really never know what you're going to get. So I think it's really good to experiment. Charity quilts are a great thing to experiment on because, you know, hey, someone's going to love this, and I don't think that their first reaction is going to be to judge your stitches or judge your design. And here's another thing, if you are consistent, so if I do the same thing in this panel and the same thing in the next decorative panel and the same thing in the next one, then it's going to look like that's the way it was meant to be, you know? And that's a good thing. Okay, I'm going to do that same marking here. So I'm just making sure I'm lining up one end of my ruler with the stitching I just did. I know I'm going to stitch down to this line too, and I'm going to mark. I might even want to use pens because some of this it's kind of hard to see. So there's a mark, and there's a mark. So roughly an inch apart or so. All right, now I unlock my channel locks and come on down. Line up with that 1 inch mark. That looks good. And I don't think you have to be super nitpicky about this. You know, I don't think that you need to be obsessive about, you know, getting everything lined up just exactly right. I'd say as long as it's close, it's going to be great. And as you can see, this is really, really fast. Now, one issue that I used to run into a lot with my long arm is I could stitch really well from left to right, but I could not stitch well from right to left. My machine tended to break thread every time I tried to go that way. And it's really frustrating. I mean, it was a small thing. I mean, you're just stitching one line across and thread breaks and you just have to move the machine over, right? It's not that big of a deal. But repeated thread breaks do get annoying, and particularly when you're quilting for speed and you're wanting to get something done fast, you want to know how to avoid thread breaks. So what I found, and I did talk to Grace Company about this, I met someone from technical service at a show, and I talked to Maria about it, and she said that I wasn't using the right size needle. I like Isocord 40 weight thread, and that thread is supposed to go with a size 18 needle. I played around with that. I had to adjust my tension quite a bit in order to work with that size of needle, but as soon as I made that change and got that tension adjustment solid, I hardly ever break thread anymore, and that's even when going in this direction. So I think that's pretty awesome, and that definitely helped me out a lot. You know, it's just one of those things that's just annoying. It can start to drive you nuts if your thread isn't balanced, if you don't have good tension, or if it's just shredding and breaking on you a lot. So I'm stitching back. You can see what this pattern is starting to look like. I think that's looking really nice. Even stitching and overlapping and covering up those leaves, I still think that's a really nice design. And I'm coming in pretty good on my marked line down there. Now stitch on down. Now, if you wanted to take this and stitch it up whole nother notch, and you wanted to stitch your lines really, really close and tight together, that's called matchsticks. And that got really popular with the modern quilting movement. Basically, it's adding the lines, but then it's adding more and more and more lines until the quilt is basically stitched on an 1/8 inch scale. So just to give you a little bit of a reference, an 1/8 inch scale is 1/8 of an inch between those lines of quilting. Right now I have 1 inch between my lines of quilting. So I would need to put pretty much 8 lines in between this in order to go to matchsticks, if not even more. So that is just one of those things that you might want to consider. Now, how would you do this? If you wanted to do matchsticks on this quilt, what would you do? Well, I would do it the exact same way I'm doing right now. I would first break up the space into 1 inch space lines because you want to stabilize this through the entire quilt. If you try and go at it with matchsticks, immediately, and I tried to stitch another line like right next to it and another line right next to it, then very, very soon the quilt would start to shrink up. Kind of think it would like condense, and those lines of stitching will start to distort the quilt. What you need to do first is you need to stabilize the quilt. You do that by putting in those 1-inch space lines. Then you go in and put in a line between. So then you have 1/2-inch spacing. Then you go in and put in another line between, and then you have 1/4-inch spacing. So you keep breaking up the space into progressively smaller pieces. And this would be through your entire quilt. So if you want matchsticks over an entire quilt, then you would first break it up and quilt the whole thing on a 1-inch scale, then a 1/2-inch scale, then a 1/4-inch scale, then an 1/8-inch scale, and then if you're really going for gold, then you could quilt it all again. And that would be quite a lot of quilting, just saying. But if that's the look you're going for, then it's worth it because it does look really cool. I've seen modern quilts quilted with matchsticks, and I can absolutely say it was the best design to use on those quilts. It really added to the design, to the kind of modern aesthetic, and it really looked good. Now we've got another space here, so I pretty much know what I'm going to do in these leafy panels, but I've got this little bit of open space here, and it's not much. I mean, it is 1.5 inches, maybe it's pushing 2 inches or so. But what I might do is just do a single line right down the middle, again, just to be sure. Whoops, this is the thing. If your channel lock is locked, you cannot move your machine. You do need to unlock that. There we go. So I'm going to push the machine back here, and I'm going to get roughly into the middle of that area, drop my needle down, lock my channel lock again, and yeah, I'm going to stitch a contrasting nice line of white thread right through the middle of that red section. And basically what that's going to do, it's going to ensure the entire quilt is quilted on a 1-inch scale, roughly. It's going to keep it all consistent. This quilt's going to look great, and best of all, I'm going to have this thing knocked out within the next hour because you can see this has taken me barely 5 minutes to stitch through this much, and I only need to advance this quilt maybe 1 or 2 times through the machine. So it's going to be very, very fast. It's very simple, and I think this quilting, the straight line, simple quilting, has really accented the surface of this very simple quilt panel. So there we go. I have a solid quilting design, and I know it's going to stitch out really quickly. And I think straight line quilting is a great style of quilting to use on charity quilts, on baby quilts, on pretty much any project that you want to get done quickly and have basically kind of a minimal style going over the surface. You don't want a lot of wiggly lines or flowers or, swirly texture. This is a great style of quilting to put on a man's quilt because it's not adding anything super decorative or girly to the surface. Straight lines are masculine, and I think that's a great choice too. I think it's very easy to discount what is fast and easy. It's easy to say, oh, well, that's just too easy. And there's a tendency, I think, to make things too complicated. And sometimes all a quilt needs is some straight line quilting, some simple texture just to hold those layers together, and it's done. A lot of my grandmas and great-grandmas quilted their quilts this way. Not on a long arm, obviously, but they stitched just straight lines about 4 inches apart going one direction and then 4 inches apart going the other direction. And they would stitch over some pretty elaborate blocks. They did applique, they did embroidery, they did traditional quilt piecing, and they stitched all of the quilts pretty much that same way. So the way I look at it is if it was good enough for my grandmothers or great-grandmothers, then it's good enough for me. And particularly on a quilt like this, I think it's great. So I'm going to turn on an audiobook or a show, and that's how I'm going to get through this because it's going to be a little on the boring side, but I'll be able to enjoy getting this quilt done in less than an hour. And that's going to be awesome because then I can put something else on the frame and be able to play and share something new with you next week. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and you'll come and check out more Frame Quilting Friday videos at leahday.com/frame. You can also check out the Grace Unique 15R and Continuum Quilting Frame that I'm working on at leahday.com/15R. Until next time, let's go quilt.